So I'm really excited to introduce our next speaker here with us today. Dr. Chavon Onumah is an internist and HIV specialist, wife and mother of two boys who currently serves as the Internal Medicine Residency Program Director and Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusive Excellence for the Department of Medicine at George Washington School of Medicine and Health Sciences. She's a proud graduate of Xavier University, Tulane's University School of Medicine and School of Public Health and Tropical Medicine, a combined MD, MPH, and the George Washington University School of Human Development, Master of Education. Her passions include medical education, health equity, healthcare workforce equity, diversity, and inclusion. And at George Washington, she co-founded and served as the inaugural vice chair of the Clara Bliss Hins Society for Women in Medicine and Health Sciences, and is an Anti-Racism Coalition Steering Committee member. So nationally, she served on various in the Alliance for Academic Internal Medicine and is the current chair of the Society of General Internal Medicine's Health Equity Commission and a Women in Medicine Commission member. So I'm so excited to hear Dr. Onumah's presentation today. So I would like for all of you to welcome her as our next speaker. So thank you.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. And I'm really excited to be here with you all today as well. And I'm going to start my screen share. So I tested this out, so it should be working fine. We're all good. All right, so I'll be talking to you all today about Beyond Theory, putting intersectionality into practice. So I would love to start off with a few disclosures. Sadly, for my student loans, I have no financial disclosures. But as far as disclaimers, I do have some of those. So I do identify as Black and African descendant of slaves. And I know some of you, as you heard my name file, perhaps she's, immigrant, African immigrant, and actually that is my married name. And so my husband is first generation Ghanaian American. However, as you can see up at the corner there, my DNA story, my maiden name is Blackburn, which is Irish, believe it or not. But this is my DNA story in that as an African descendant of slaves, I do have ancestry from West Africa, Central Africa, East Africa, the Americas, and Europe. I'm a cisgender woman, heterosexual, Christian, first generation college graduate, wife, mother, physician educator, among other things. As you see my family here down in the corner, my extended family, my aunt, sister, friend, all of those wonderful things. And I list my disclaimers more so in the order in which those were introduced to me, not necessarily their level of importance. But I'm really mainly listing these to let you all know that I am coming from these intersecting identities, but I do not claim to speak to or speak for all of these different identities. And most importantly, while I've been doing this work for some time, I'm learning and growing at the same time as you all. So I may not have all the answers, but we're here to learn and grow together. So just a little bit about the agenda, what we're hoping for today really is to go over some of the, definitions of intersectionality and allyship, describe the experience of some women with intersecting identities, and identifies ways to incorporate intersectional approaches to promoting equity in academia. So I would love for everyone chime in when you are ready. Please be fully present and participate respectfully. This is a courageous, safe space, and hopefully we'll trust everyone's intent, but I'll acknowledge impact if there is any, and just be kind. This is a place of growth and inquiry, not judgment, and also knowing that some of the things we talk about, some of us may feel more or less comfortable about. And so we just need to, recognize our level of discomfort. All right, if I have any questions about the ground rules objectives, let me know. So here's our agenda. We'll talk a little bit about the issues, the terminology, and then focus on strategies. I know that's what we're excited about. I saw your program for today. I was excited. I was like, I wish I didn't have work to do. I can come join them. But so I'm going to start off here. It's going to require a little bit of participation, and I'm trying to look at the chat as well. But so you see two pictures here that are a few centuries apart. What do you see in these pictures? And I will look into the chat, see if anyone wants to comment or unmute. That's fine too.
I think our chat is disabled for, do you want us to enable it for your presentation?
Oh, yeah, sure, that'd be great. Oh, no wonder.
Jonathan, are you able to enable chat for this presentation? Oh, it's done.
Oh, perfect. Okay, it's like, oh, they all left already. No. Okay, it is a whole lot of men. So interestingly, yes, the definition of a mantle. So this first picture on I guess should be left, right, the older picture, is a picture of our forefathers. And then a few centuries later, this picture, the more modern picture, is a picture that was taken of a group that was making some decisions about women's health over right down the street from my office in Washington, D.C., down at the White House. So yeah, lots of men. So it's clear that at least phenotypically, there's a homogeneous group of folks that is making decisions for an entire group of people that are not represented, right? And so we're always wondering, like, wait, who is not in the room? Really important as we, think about this talk and what we're going to talk about today. So speaking of DC, we shared a little bit about my background. I'm originally from the Chicago area, and just to, let you know, I, of course, have been to a number of different places, all pretty different, right? So we talked about New Orleans. I did residency training in the Twin Cities of Minnesota. And now I'm here in DC, and DC happens to be one of the most ethnically diverse cities. This is just a look at one of the, right here, the maps of DC. It's still a little bit segregated, but this is specifically the Black population. At one point, DC was over 50% African American. A nice amount of Hispanic population, and then also immigrant populations as well. And then here is GW. This was our, I believe, class of 2021. And you can see we're looking pretty diverse. We've got a lot of women going on, starting to see a little melanin in there. So this is exciting, right? And then we go to, this is actually, was my residency program. Year earlier on, when I first came here, and was doing more work on the clerkship side. And so we're thinking about this very ethnically diverse area, and finding some diversity in our medical students and increasing there. And then in the residency program, we're maybe not doing as well as we think we should for a place that's so ethnically diverse. And knowing that diversity equals excellence is really crucial as we're trying to overcome these health inequities. It was, really essential to me to focus on this issue as I was trying to move towards improving health equity for patients and communities. And so the workforce was kind of where I came in. So here's where I came into medicine for equity, right? So just little definitions about equity. I know you all are familiar with that. I just want to make sure we're all on the same terms. And so, essentially, many of us have seen variations of this illustration, and basically we have, equality versus equity. Equity is this concept that everyone has the necessary resources and opportunities to reach their full potential. But on this illustration, you have people who are inherently different, but have similar barriers in place to obtain a common good. Now, with equality, we have this equal distribution, but we know in reality, people are starting at different points and there's not an equal distribution anyway. That's a fallacy. But nevertheless, when we really try to move towards equity and making sure that people have everything, you really want to think more about the structures, the systems that are in place. And so we start to think of these concepts of, liberation, really dismantling the structures of barriers for everyone. And then you move on to this idea of inclusion. Right. And the way that I like to think about inclusion, so after you have the justice and liberation, removing those barriers, what are, diversity is being invited to the dance, inclusion is being invited to the party, but then you have belonging, which is dancing like no one is watching. And if you take that a step further, belonging is not just dancing like no one is watching. Belonging is also having the opportunity to choose what is on the playlist. You put some song requests in too. I haven't been to a good club in a long time, but I remember I love to go to the DJ and actually ask for requests so that I could feel like, hey, this is my party too. So so here is where we are. That's where we like to be, right? Well, what is holding us back? So, if we use Dr. Kamara Jones' definition of racism as a system of structuring opportunity and assigning value based on the social interpretation of how one looks, that's what we consider race, right? That unfairly, disadvantages some individuals and communities and saps the strength of the whole society, which is basically a waste of human resources. It's really going to take this, truly anti-racist approach, an intersectional approach to promote equity, inclusion, and belonging. And so Dr. Kamara Jones has also given us a few value targets for anti-racist action. And I've listed them here, and this could be a whole talk in of itself. So I'm not going to spend as much time here, but I want to highlight a few that I think are really important for our intersectionality talk today. So, as you saw, there was a narrow focus on the individual. So we've done, in the last few years of the awakening, as I like to call it, where we as a community society have really tried to do some inner thinking about how historically where we've gone wrong and ways that we can improve. There's been a lot of talk about individual bias, implicit bias, and what have you. And I think that we know I don't think we know the individual bias contributes to inequities in academic medicine, right? So both implicit and explicitly, you have these, ways that these structural isms that happen because the operation of our explicit and implicit biases at the population level leads to the accumulation of discriminatory practices. And that continues to perpetuate this cycle, right? But when we focus too much on the individual to the point that it makes, these systems and structures seem irrelevant, it really undermines our effectiveness and our ability to work collectively to dismantle the structures that continue to maintain these systems of hierarchy and disadvantage. So, so that's a really important concept for us to think about as we start thinking about strategies. Then many of you have probably seen a similar cartoon here. So this myth of meritocracy. So this idea, if you work hard, you will make it. And yes, it is true. I know all of you all here on this Zoom and many others who have made it, if you will, have worked very hard. At the same time, there are some that have made it to wherever they would like to be that maybe didn't work as hard because they had other structures or legacies, networks, or things that have given them an additional boost, right? So it's, there's also people that are working maybe even harder than some of us that have some privilege in ways that don't quite make it to the level that they would like to as well. So I think, this myth of meritocracy is really just outlining, and this cartoon outlines that, the playing field is not always level, right? And so some of us have more hurdles to get through. and that the systems that continue to maintain, racism, sexism, heterosexism, capitalism, other systems of structured inequity are, creating more barriers, right? So, and then the other kind of target that I'll just mention briefly is this zero-sum mindset. So if you gain, I lose, which is interesting. And I know we all like to win, but it's a myth. We know that, right? That there is actually room for all of us. And what it does is when we have this zero-sum mindset, that there's only room for one of us to succeed or one of us to achieve health equity or equity and promotion or what have you, it fosters this competition over cooperation, and it masks the cost of inequity, right? That racism or sexism or whatever ism actually saps energy from society, and it hinders our collective growth efforts. I love this book, The Sum of Us, which highlights kind of some of the historical context that I won't be able to go into today, and how we've, in a number of ways, fed into that zero-sum mindset as a society. So when we think about some of these terms, we always, want to make sure we consider our own privilege. And so privilege is our unearned access to social power that's based on membership to a certain group. And sometimes it's, groups that we were just born into. Sometimes there are groups that, well, I went to college now, so I earned that. I worked hard for that, right? But one way that I love to think about it, again, I love Dr. Kamara Jones, as you can see, but it's when you think something is not a problem because it's not a problem to you personally. And so I'll just, give it an example of, I went on a field trip with my son's school, and one of the young children that I was hosting in my group was non-binary. And so when I took the kids to the restroom at this museum, there were only women and men. And so the first time we went, I didn't think much about it. And, the other boys in my group went to the restroom. And this one non-binary kid decided, oh, they didn't have to use the restroom. So I said, oh, okay. I didn't think anything about it. And then the second time we went to the restroom, I thought, is there may be some discomfort. And I had to ask, would you like me to go to this other restroom with you? How do you feel? But this was not a problem to me. I've never had to experience that, because at this point, my boys do identify as boys at this point. That may change, but so that's one way to think about privilege. You have that opportunity to even forget that that's not an issue. So I want us to just, if you use this power wheel, think about all the ways that we are privileged here in this Zoom room today. And as we move forward, we're going to tap into some of that privilege. So I, as was mentioned, have really been instrumental in thinking about gender equity at my own institution. And then on a, kind of more national level, I did some research looking at women faculty, and specifically in internal medicine across the US. And I looked at factors that, not myself, but my team and I, we looked at factors that were positively associated with women's intent to remain at one's institution, because we know about all of these reasons why people leave a lot of times, right? And so we saw these were the things that were statistically associated with women remaining in an institution: fair and transparent policies, opportunities for work-life integration, helping employees recognize their bias, fair compensation, fair provision of resources, satisfaction with mentorship, peer mentorship, and women role models. All of these things I know you all talked about today, I'm sure. And yes, this was great. But then the other thing we found with this research is that the only demographic factor associated with lower odds of remaining at one's institution, and in academic medicine, were that of people that identify as Black or other race. And, I'm not going to go into the stats. I'm sure you all are aware of the disparities as far as faculty in, traditionally or historically marginalized group, but it's already very small amounts. And the fact that these were the groups that were least likely to want to remain or have intent to remain in academic medicine at one's institution, definitely hit home for me. So I ask us, in our fight for gender equity, retention, and promotion of women in academic medicine, we have to ask, why are people of color and women of color in particular leaving academic medicine? And so, I just put up a few case studies here. Four amazing women in medicine who's either have left academic medicine or on their own or been forced out, stories that you may have heard of on, social media. Dr. Aisha Curry was suspended from a teaching position after a frank, conversation about her experience with racism in a small group. Dr. Stella Sappho, who has a lawsuit at a large institution with a number of other faculty about, gender and race discrimination at her institution. Dr. Uche Blackstock wrote this very nice article here talking about how she left her faculty position of 9 years due to, a toxic and oppressive work environment. And here she was put in a place to actually promote equity and inclusion. And then, for me as a program director, Dr. Princess Dinar, who was suspended after a decade long of leadership role shortly after filing a lawsuit for sexist and racist behaviors. And I don't know all the details about these, but these are just examples. And of course, there are many more stories, and there are other stories about women of other intersecting identities. I was just in a talk for SGIM, and one of our colleagues shared about a program director of Latino descent that actually had to step down because she was getting so much pushback as a program director. And then what the advice was when she stepped down was, well, next time we probably need a white male so he doesn't get as much pushback, right? So lack of support in so many ways. I did choose to center here on Black women as that's my primary intersecting identity here, but just to, think about these stories as we kind of think, well, why does this happen? What is the experience of women and historically marginalized groups in academic medicine? And so, we have these microaggressions that you all are familiar with, that are the subtle, the daily little mosquito bites, that after so much, you're fed up, right? And then on a macro level, though, the data has shown that women start off with less administrative, for women and underrepresented minorities, start off with less administrative support for similar roles. There's bias seen in so many ways. I probably don't have to go through this with you all because you've probably talked about a number of these things, but underrepresentation as speakers, as first authors, citations, more non-career advancing activities. And then there's just less support. So women and underrepresented minorities tend to do some of this DEI work because maybe that's what we're passionate about and we're change agents and what have you. But then there's less support and recognition for that work. And, often we're being charged, the onus is on us to lead these efforts. And then we have less mentorship and sponsorship is not as much in the literature, but I will put that up there as well. So this is the experience. This is what folks are dealing with. And what does that mean? It's going to be some negative effects on performance, productivity, well-being, retention, promotion, all of these things. And so this is why intersectionality is so important. So, the definition, the term really came from this 1970s movement, feminism movement. And this is when, folks were focusing on gender equity and we were all excited. But what happened is that a number of Black feminist scholars realized that they weren't necessarily at the table with some of these feminist movements, right? And so Kimberly Crabshaw, who's at the top, she was a law professor at UCLA, really first coined this term in a piece that she wrote in 1989. And intersectionality really refers to the ways that race, class, gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, ability, status, and other markers of differences really intersect to inform individual realities, perspectives, and lived experiences. So it's really, when you think about it, I love the cake metaphor. If you are baking a cake and you're putting in all those ingredients, yes, by themselves, they're different ingredients. But once you bake that cake, you cannot take out those different ingredients, right? You can't pull out the eggs or the flour. I haven't baked a cake in a long time, but you can't pull out all that different stuff. So the point is that these are all a part of you, and it changes, or your experience is make up a big part of how you interact with the world. But the concept of intersectionality is also that, not just awareness and analysis of those power imbalances that contribute, but we should also be using it as a tool in which those imbalances can be eliminated. So we're going to, transition here and think about some strategies. What are some things that you can do if you want to take this intersectional approach? And I think, number one key is really being intentional, right? So this intentionality through allyship. And so I have here just kind of some definitions and thinking about that. And so when you think about allyship, I think I've seen a number of illustrations where it's maybe pyramids or stepping stones, but I think of it, I really like this depiction because it is more of a cycle, because especially with different intersections, you're continuing to learn and grow. And so if you think of an ally or as the thinking and learning phase, and it's really personal, it's more self-centered, you're learning, you're reading or what have you, then you don't really have much risk at stake here. But as you become an accomplice, you start becoming involved in showing up for historically excluded groups, right? So that's when you're starting to interrogate, well, what institutional biases are in play here, and start thinking about, like, what can we do? So I'm learning, now I'm thinking about, okay, what can I do for these groups? And then as a co-conspirator or co-creator is some term that some folks like to use because that's a little bit of a more positive connotation. But really, this is the, nothing about us can be done without us, right? So this is where you're showing up with those historically excluded groups. It is you're having meaningful relationships, you're seeking to understand, and you invite folks to the table, right? You don't co-opt the cause as a co-conspirator or a co-creator. You're offering meaningful support. So you ask, well, how can I show up? Or, let me get in and help with that. You collaborate, you amplify. Those are ways. And we'll talk about some other strategies as well. And this, little picture here gives a, depiction. I know a number of us have done book clubs and things, and it goes from having your community discussions to now collecting the data as a thinking about suggestions as a accomplice, and then collecting the data as a co-conspirator. So those are like the general, I guess, cycle as I talked about. But I think most importantly, like, just being curious too. Like, if you don't have people of color around you or people from, historically excluded groups, ask the question why, and figure out how can I change that, right? Being really intentional about that process. So, thinking of principles, there are so many principles, and I was like, okay, I don't have a lot of time, and I don't want to bore them, but but I think just to kind of bring it home on some tips and some strategies. So first off, like I said, bias is important, and we want to recognize our own bias and implement evidence-based strategies to mitigate it. So we know about bias awareness and training, which is important. It's not a one-off. We continue to work on those, right? These are evidence-based strategies, by the way. So I've done some work, systemic reviews with colleagues that we've kind of looked and seen, well, what actually works to mitigate bias. So mindfulness therapy, or just actually being mindful, actually helps to mitigate bias. So if we can practice that on a daily basis, not just when we're thinking about intersectionality, but just being more present and in the moment. That's why I charged you all to be present. Then diversifying experiences, individuation, and perceived variability. So specifically, individuation is like this ability to see people as not just a part of their group, but you associate their unique characteristics as them as a person, right? So then that way, people experience less discrimination when that outgroup is seen as homogenous. So the key is just really trying to see people for who they are as individuals, and trying to reframe ourselves for putting, and I would say even for have that illustration of all the white men. Not all white men are the same, right? So individuation works both ways. And and just really thinking about the variability between groups. Recognizing within groups that there are differences. So for instance, when we ask a question and we make a statement that, oh, faculty are doing X, well, which faculty, which women? So just like with our research. So we saw that these trends, well, which women was this a trend for? We really tried to de-aggregate the data. And that's really important when you're asking these questions as you're doing your work for gender equity or whatever equitable work that you're doing. Should we separate out even further regional or community versus academic, those types of things. Recognizing that we all have points of privilege and points of oppression. So going back to our power wheel and thinking about all of those privilege points or oppressive points, and then acknowledging the systems and structures of discrimination and inequities that they're linked. So these systems that maintain racial and ethnic privilege in society are the same exact systems that maintain gender, class, heterosexual, and ability privilege. It's the same, general concept that started it, and it's going to require the same dismantling, same work. So it's impossible to really just try to challenge one system without challenging the others. And I think that's one really major take home I hope we get. Respect and center the voice of those affected. So I talked about a little bit that allyship to, accomplice, co-conspirator. Co-conspirators are great about really centering that voice to those affected and taking away self from it. Considering the role of inequity or hierarchy of power and privilege plays. So in this, it's all, well, the question I have to ask myself is, if I see something that looks sexist, what role might racism be playing here? If, and vice versa, if I see something that looks racist, what role might sexism or classism or ableism or what have you? So always thinking about those other intersecting identities, and importantly, incorporating different perspectives. So asking ourselves, who is not at the table? Who is not at your research meeting? Who haven't you cited? Whose voice is not being heard? And then collaboration is key. So when I say collaborate, I want to be clear. So you want to collaborate and make sure that there's an equitable investment. And we talked about, what equity looks like. It's not equal investment, equitable investment. So you have to be careful of the tokenism or the minority tax as well. So that's, a key. And so, going back to our slide, I actually borrowed this from ACGME talk, which I loved. But I think, it makes me think about, even when I talk about this, who is not in the room, it should always prompt us to see whose voice is not at the table, who is not being heard, and when we think about equity. So I'm going to give just a few, little tips, hopefully take home points that I hope you all can commit to. So daily practice intersectionality, what does that look like? So perspective taking. So moving towards this idea of perspective taking, but actually perspective believing. So not just putting yourself in someone else's perspective, but actually believing their perspective. Like when someone tells you that they have been through something, and that's their personal experience, believe them, right? Nudging. So this is I love this idea, and have seen it in action, where we use our own privilege to influence someone else toward more equitable behavior. So for instance, we may be the one woman in the room, and we know that there is a male with a lot of power in the room, but he's one of our accomplices or maybe co-conspirators. And sometimes our voices don't get heard. So we might nudge that male, hey, I really need you to say X so that this point gets moved forward, or what have you. That's a way of nudging. So because we have power of being that one person in the room, but perhaps we're still talked over, how that happens. And so we're now having someone else use their privilege or power to nudge, to speak up as well. amplify. So I love to see when folks are doing this intentionally. So building off of what X said, I know we've all been in spaces where, you said one thing and then just the next minute, John says it and everyone's like, oh yes, we should just totally do that. And you're like, I just said that. Well, so that's why we need to amplify each other and make sure that we're building off of. So it shows, it gives credit where credit is due, right? And it validates that person that thought that they were not heard, but someone did hear them. And then thinking about organizations, what can we do just more on a systemic level? So I'm really here using my social ecological model as a public health med-ed person and thinking about the different categories here. And so I talked a little bit about individual bias awareness training, mindfulness, and these other opportunities. And then interpersonal really comes in the allyship, accomplices, working as accomplices. But then you have your upstander training, which I hope we're all doing and doing on a regular basis to get those skills to make sure that we are able to speak up if the occasion occurs. And I've talked about some of those daily strategies already, but then on the more community and structural level, can you recommend or think about affinity groups, professional development programs as you all have here today, mentorship, sponsorship, and then structural change? Like, what's the commitment? What's the organization's commitment to cultural change, right? And what does that look like? And does that mean changes in promotion processes or structures or requirement, resource support and other programs, open calls for and structured interviews for different opportunities, and clear reporting and reward structures, right? And particularly conspirators, co-conspirators, and co-creators are going to work in this space with those from historically marginalized groups to impact change here. That's what that looks like. So I would be remiss about talking about the ways that we can change without thinking about, self, right? So, thriving as change agents and thinking about, self-advocacy. I think one of the best pieces of advice I got, not early on in my career actually, but when I got it, it was great. But it was to design my own personal mission statement. And that has been so helpful for me. And really my mission statement is kind of like Maya Angelou. I think we're like sisters in some ways, but anyway, but essentially my own mission statement, equity is at my core. So for me, since I'm passionate about equity work, and it was really important for me to communicate my vision in the case that inclusive excellence was everyone's work and provide these tools for like my institution and other organizations, but empower other people to see what role that they can play. That's why I'm here today. But I want to just make sure that we are cognizant that not every person of color or person of a marginalized group wants to or should be expected to take that onus of advocating for equity for those groups that they belong in, right? They may have other priorities, other things, and that is okay because, we don't want to add on to that minority tax. We know that impacts retention and promotion and really hinders our collective growth. But that's why we all want to do this work together. However, for me, I willingly put in that work because this was important to me. But the key was I knew that for this to be sustainable, I would have to have some what I call necessary endings. And to prevent this, work from negatively impacting me and really impacting my work-life integration, I had to identify like which commitments can I step away from that were not in line with my mission, right? My vision. Some of these things I might enjoy. Yeah, it was fun. Others I was happy to give up, but I had to step away from some roles and really try to continue to negotiate and scale back so that I could really follow one of my favorite authors, Audre Lorde. But caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it's self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare. So So here's a little bit of intersectionality in practice. So yes, I talked a lot about Black women because that's my intersection, but guess what? Here are some of my mentees. I have one of my fabulous Latina surgeons now that's doing great. I have another, right there at the poster is one of my mentees who is Jewish. And so I've learned a lot about her experience. I have an immigrant first gen, well, no, actually immigrant mentee. So I'm practicing this intersectionality with my own individual mentee relationships, right? Here's some intersectionality in practice with, I'm going to actually highlight some folks in my institution. So we have our Women's Society, Clearville Science Society, as you heard about, and I was on the inaugural board and really instrumental in getting that going. But so one of my co-executive board members is seen here working with me in our anti-racism coalition and really co-conspirating, if that's a word, with me. Co-conspiring probably is the word, but working with me and others to really move this anti-racism effort forward at our institution. And so that was definitely intersectionality in practice. All right. So I am going to challenge you all. I'm doing good in time. I'm excited. Okay, so I want to challenge you all to think about, I talked about a number of different principles and strategies, but what will you commit to today? And I can go back to the slides and you want some ideas, but I am going to have you take out your phones and open up a calendar invite for today. And then I want you to entitle it Intersectionality. I want you to jot down in the details an actionable step that you can take to practice intersectionality. And then I want you to repeat it. Send it like a calendar invite for every 3 months, and you're going to edit it as you continue on your journey, your allyship journey, right? The big bonus is if you actually check in with one of your colleagues that's here on Zoom today, or me, I put my email there. You can find me on Twitter and just check in and see, wait, how are we doing with whatever goal that we had, right? So I'm going to pause here for a moment and let you all do your, not really homework, your Zoom work right now. Right, so I gave you a little bit of time. You can come back to it too. You may be still thinking, maybe you're making a long list and maybe you want to share it with the group because we will have some time for discussion. But essentially the take-home points, the intersectionality recognizes that we are shaped by multiple intersecting identities and each have different points of privilege and oppression. And the systems that maintain racial and ethnic privilege in society are the same systems that maintain gender, class, heterosexual, and ability privilege. So we know that there are strategies, evidence-based strategies to mitigate bias, address these inequities, and support historically marginalized groups, right? But what we really need to move forward and progress, it's going to require an intentional intersectional approach as allies, accomplices, and co-conspirators or co-creators. So I'm hoping that you all will join me in this quest. Feel free to ask any questions. I'm happy to take those or work on your Zoom work.
That was a great presentation. Chavon, thanks so much for being here today with all of us. Feel free to put questions in the chat. And I just wanted to say it was really insightful and really thought-provoking. And I really like the idea of sort of viewing our activities and, even our committees and, people that are on, hiring committees and things like that through the view of a lens of intersectionality. So I think that's a really great thought. And I also really like the the homework or Zoom work you gave us, because I think sometimes it is about being intentional. We hear about these great ideas and we all are probably, if we were in person live, you'd probably see a lot of people nodding in agreement and really saying that this is a great idea. And then we leave and we go back to our busy lives. And it's really hard sometimes to then put those things into practice. So I think it's a great idea to put it in the calendar, have it, repeating, and then adding that extra step of having an accountability partner to sort of say, hey, let's sort of see how we can make changes. So one question I wanted to ask you before I get to the questions in the chat is, if you are sort of what are some ways that you can create change within your own little sphere of influence within your work environment, especially if you're not in a position of power that you can't really make that change, at a system-wide policy sort of position, and just sort of want to make changes within your own environment?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think so within your own sphere, there are a number of things that we can do just in supporting people that are among us, right, and learning and growing. So that first initial step of allyship. But then as we start to, what I like to do is have us think back to, we all have a little bit of power privilege. We may not have a big, title, leadership role, but, we may be in, let's say, the town hall, and something is said that someone didn't really think about that intersectional lens. I can speak up because perhaps maybe the person of this, marginalized group is not in the room, or may not speak up, or did not speak up at the time, right? So there are ways that you can do that on I guess I don't want to call it a smaller scale, because I think it's all important, but to do that on a daily basis without necessarily having a big chunk of a program or a division or department that you're in charge of. And that matters. So, and I don't want anyone to get me wrong in that, allyship is important, like allies are important, each step is important. And so thinking about how you can do that on the individual basis too, those little touches all add up. It's changing the culture piece by piece. And then I see, there's another question too about language. If someone's trying to redirecting someone who is pushing you or someone else into a role they feel uncomfortable with. Well, I always love to, especially after some negotiation series of strategy or training that I've done, I always like to say, wow, that sounds like a great opportunity. Not the one for me though. And I like to have them consider other people's. I usually try to come with other people. I think it's hard, especially as early career women. We sometimes take on things because we're like, oh, this is an opportunity. And that's a challenging position to be in. But I think acknowledging that this is a great opportunity, not in line with and I've used that too, this is not really in line with my personal mission at this point. But have you considered, and I will give them, usually I try to give them some other women's names if I think it's a great opportunity. If I'm like, well, I don't want anyone to take that opportunity, then I'll just try not to recommend anyone. But
yeah, I think, first is sort of determining if it really is an opportunity. Then is it an opportunity for you? And then sort of really learning and sort of aligning. I think that sort of heralds back to our last session. We talked a little bit about sort of trying to have that career development plan, really defining what your passion and purpose is, and trying to figure out if that aligns with that. And if it doesn't, finding a way to sort of say no gently. And I love the idea of sort of saying, I may not be the right person for this at this time, but here's someone else you may reach out to. And that gives the other person sort of an opportunity to sort of.
And I think, just to piggyback on that, I think sometimes what happens is we think if we say no, then people won't consider us for the next opportunity. And which I have not found that to be true. I've said no to some things, and then, next week, someone is like, oh yeah, well, what about this? And I said, I just told you I couldn't do the other thing. So I haven't found that to be true. So I think that's our own like negative self-talk telling us that, oh, if I say no to this, then it may limit my opportunities later on.
Yeah, there's another question in the chat that, or in the Q&A that says, what are key short and long-term markers or measures for success for this type of work? So when you're doing all of this work and you're, talking about programming or putting in policies and procedures, having this type of work, how do you actually measure the impact that, to make sure that all this energy that we're expending is actually creating change within our culture, within our environment?
Yes, that's a great question. And I think you're right, data is so important. Now, it depends on, I think, what the changes that you are making. So of course, when we're talking about diversity, folks might look at ratios, but for me, I'm more thinking about like the inclusion, the belonging piece. So looking at our, for faculty, exit surveys, when people are leaving, why are they leaving? Looking at our climate surveys, we do a lot of, for our residents, more like town halls, listening sessions. We have some affinity groups where people can kind of tell what's going on. So the data piece is harder, I will admit. And I think as a medical society, we are just now beginning to think about how to truly measure this. And when we, health equity is a different piece, and I think we have better ways, but that's more of a way long range goal. But it's specifically when we think about equity within the, realm of academic medicine, it's a lot harder. I think one thing that I've been trying to even push our division department on is really like dashboards and metrics on a departmental level. I think is really helpful in that asset accountability piece. And so seeing when we think about cultural change, well, now how many people are actually working on things that promote equity, right? And having to show that for their promotions portfolios or their annual reports and things of that nature. And then you can measure across departments how well we're doing in this space too.
Yeah, I think I agree with you. It's a difficult thing to measure, and so there's some of it is like measuring the diverse population that you have. So the numbers, that's like a numbers game, and then it's a little bit harder to sort of quantify the inclusivity and then really thinking about belonging, because I feel like sometimes there's so much emphasis on creating a diverse work environment, which I think is very valuable and important. But in order to retain that group, you need to also work on the other pieces, which I think are really important and really, I think are now sort of being discussed more. And I think we need to sort of definitely put some emphasis on that.
No, a great point. So it was interesting. We got our match, and people were like, "Oh, are you excited? It looks like such a diverse group." And I say, "Yes, I'm excited. They all look great." And really, I'll really know come second year, once they're working in the hospital and leading the teams. But no, seriously. But what I said, but honestly, my work is really just beginning, because getting this wonderful diverse group here to train and help and serve our patients and learn from each other is one piece. But then how do I make sure that they're thriving while they're here, right? That everyone has this sense of belonging. And so, match day was like, okay, now next day, what are we doing to make sure our residents are, this cohesive group that are learning and growing and thriving together.
Yeah, and I think the key point that you mentioned is not just surviving, but thriving, right? They feel like they're actually thriving in that environment, which I think is really important. Does any of our panelists have any questions for Dr. Onumah before we say goodbye? No? Okay. Well, I think this was fantastic. I hope that all of the participants did take out their phones and, put in, something. I feel like, and I think I love how you emphasize those small things that we can do, which, you hate to say that they're small, because I do feel like every action creates a change. And so anything that you can do, because I feel like sometimes people feel like it's overwhelming, like it's an all or nothing, like, oh, I can't make a change at a grand level, so nothing's gonna, it won't matter. But I think just sort of thinking a little bit more intentionally about what you can do and how you can influence the workspace you're in, it can be really powerful, whether it's with your colleagues, with your staff, with your learners. And I think that can be really important. So I also want to charge everybody with the same thing that Dr. Onumah said too, is just sort of, thinking about intentional ways you can make changes on a day-to-day basis. And as we're also advocating for those larger policies and procedures and all those changes as well. So thank you so much for being here with us. And Dr. Onumah's active on Twitter. So if anybody's on Twitter, she's a great person to follow, posts a lot of really great thought-provoking posts as well. So thank you so much for being here with us today.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation. I hope that you all have had, I know you have, I looked at the schedule, so I'm sure it's a fantastic session today, and lots of learning and growing. And just to reiterate that point too, because I know at least there's some residents here too. And I will say, like, every level, every step of the way, there is something that we can do. And I know residency is challenging. I'm not telling you all to take on a big chunk and move mountains, but but there are always, even small changes that we can make that really, amplifies and makes a larger change in the long run. So thank you all.
It looks like maybe Dr. Spencer wanted to say something. You unmuted.
Oh, I just wanted to smile at Chavon. I was just turning my camera on to give a smile. I was excited to get to spend so much time with you last week and give you all the hugs in person. So I wanted to show you a smile and not just my photo. Great to see you. Thank you.
Thank you. I know it's hard. I see the names, but thank you for being here. And it's good to see you all. I hope you have a great rest of the session. And I think it's phenomenal that you're having a whole day dedicated to this. So keep it up. Great work, you all.
Yeah, thank you for being a part of it. We're so appreciative.
Thank you for a great talk.
Yeah, it was fantastic. I wish we were all in person so we could clap for each other.
I know, next time, I'll have to come out to St. Louis.
Yeah, definitely.
All right, take care.
All right, thank you.